The American Museum of Natural History in New York City is taking action to remove human remains from its displays after reports raised legal and ethical concerns. The museum, holding about 12,000 individuals' remains, will revise its policies to emphasize the importance of returning these remains. The decision follows an investigation by the art crime professor Erin Thompson, who found a lack of publicly available information about the remains. The museum acknowledges the historical misuse of human remains in scientific research rooted in eugenics and racism and aims to address these concerns. A substantial number of these remains belong to Native Americans, about 26%. With ongoing repatriation efforts in accordance with the law, and Thompson has also shared a database to help people discover if their ancestors' remains are in the museum's collection. This article is from ArtNet and published October 19th, 2023. Um, Phil, do you want to give us a comment on this?
Oh, yes. First of all, what do they mean by the human remains? Right? Some people might be wondering what they mean by remains. Basically, human remains can mean the bodies and parts of bodies of members of a species, Homo sapiens. This includes osteological material, that is, whole or part skeletons, individual bones, fragments of bones and teeth, soft tissue, including organs and skin, cornea, eyes, hmm, bone marrow, embryos, and slight preparations of human tissue, nails, and hairs. But the question is, I think that is going through everyone's mind is, how did the museum acquire these human remains? Hmm. Were they acquired and held legally and with consent from the family members or the ethnic group to which they belong? Was there a suspicion of illicit trade? Hmm. Uh, Elizabeth Blair, an NPR reporter, reported that they came from doing some investigative research. She found that they come from like medical schools, stolen from sacred burial sites, and some are donations from brokers. And sadly, some of these remains were used in eugenics research, which is kind of a flawed science agenda based in white supremacy. So these remains were used to try to support doing research on these. You did genetic type research where they were trying to use these remains as to uh, show that people of color or persons, melanated persons, were less than human. Or not only that, but Native American groups, indigenous groups, are less than human. They are not as superior as themselves. That is really sad that such things were done with these human remains. And many of these remains also belong to enslaved African Americans. Um, and the thing is that this museum, this museum that we are talking about specifically had like 12,000 human remains. And out of that 12,000, only 10%, 1,200 was returned over the decades. This is really sad. So, this is some serious stuff going on here. Um, Kelley, what is your take on this?
I probably have a real unpopular opinion here because I don't really care like what happens to my remains after I'm gone because I'm not going to care. There is an old Tao story. It's one of my favorite ones to tell about when Lao Tzu died. he was the father of Taoism, and Confucius was one of his contemporaries, and they had two completely different schools of thought. But Confucius recognized Lao Tzu as a great scholar, so he went to the funeral. And when he got there, Lao Tzu's closest friends were basically having a party, playing instruments, just having a good time. And Confucius was appalled, and he looked at him and he said, "How can you do this? You're supposed to be obeying the proper rituals." And one of Lao Tzu's friends looked at Confucius, pointed at the body, and said, "What does he care about rituals now?" So I've always kind of had that kind of attitude about it. And I realize that that's not a common feeling in today's world. And I realize that a lot of people's, the people that are left behind probably don't want something like that done with their loved ones, that they do care about what happens to them. So I can see where the concern comes from. I know I'm not like everyone. I realize that. And I think that if you are going to have human remains on display, the permissions of the people whose remains those are should have been gotten beforehand. Now, I don't know how you're going to do that with ancient remains. We can talk about that later. But unfortunately, in most of these cases, the museum didn't have the permission to have these things. So, John, I'm going to swing it back to you.
Okay. It is kind of non-consensual body desecration in my mind for what now amounts to a pseudoscience, though in the 18th and 19th centuries it was considered legitimate science. I do feel it's disrespectful to the families and the communities of these remains deserve to know where they are. One of the things is that nobody bothered to tell anybody in these collections, anybody's family, where they were. The bodies just disappeared. So now they're trying to figure out whose body is it. That's going to be pretty difficult. They do have some records, and they've been trying to piece together some. But actually, Thompson, who wrote the article in the other article in Hyper Allergic, has found at least the regions and the tribes of 10,500 of the 12,000 remains. And she has information on them. Some of these are specific to the families. They have one example of a man in Tanzania, I believe, who was hung as part of the genocide of the Germans did on the German West African colony. And they shipped his corpse up to an anthropologist in Berlin who kept it for many years. And then eventually his widow sold it to the American Natural History Museum in New York. And so and I think they've actually identified the bones and they have it in a box, but they have not repatriated them to Tanzania or this man's grandson, who he's in his 70s now, and he really wants to have his grandfather's remains to go in the tribal sacred site. So again, they're dragging their feet on it, sometimes claiming poverty and other times coming up with, well, if you can't keep it in a human-controlled space, which they did with the so-called Copper Man, which was found in a mine in Peru, I believe, or a South American country. So this is something that really bothers me because they say they're changing their stuff. And granted, it is recent because they didn't start even thinking about this until it was exposed in the press by the art criminal investigator that they might be, having broken the law about this. And the thing is that this museum isn't the only one. There are over 100,000 bodies that were illicitly gotten from various and are now in various institutions. The Smithsonian alone has 33,000 and Harvard University has 22,000. There are a lot of institutions involved in this. However, they have actually started in earnest trying to return as many as they can. And the law that says they have to return Native American and foreign native remains to the concerned parties, the tribes, was passed in 1990. That is 33 years ago, and they've only sent back 1,200 overseas. They actually funded some of the expeditions to grave rob the Inuit and Eskimo peoples and some other tribes in South America. They sent their own people to rob graves for this. Granted, at the time, they didn't think of them as human, but still, they're human. And I don't buy any excuses at this point that they can't repatriate these. That's BS. I mean, like I said, put them in a box, seal it up, send it DHS to Tanzania, and he'll get them. It's like, how hard can this be? So I'm a little bit upset about that. So anyway, Helen, do you have anything to add to this?
I'm going to bring it to Phil first because he was making some good points before we moved to Kelley. So I'm going to bring it back to Phil for a second, okay? And then I have plenty to say, so don't you all worry about it. I do.
Okay, thanks, Helen. But Jonathan, you made some interesting points there, and it brings into question whether or not this museum, which I think they did not, followed the general guidelines of dealing with human remains. Actually, I came across some information on Museum Galleries dot their website that points out the main responsibilities of museums managing these human remains. Things like rigor, honesty, and integrity. You realize that museum did not follow that. Sensitivity. They were not sensitive really to the persons to whom family members to whom the remains would belong, or even the groups, the ethnic groups, indigenous groups. Sensitivity, respect, openness, and transparency. They weren't that open, as you said. They only decide to put on this face in the press after Erin Thompson sent a report to them exposing the problems in legality and ethics of acquiring those remains, right? And another thing what that the museum did not do is they just had the remains, but there was a lack of publicly available information about the remains, like where they were from, how they were acquired, etc., who they belong to, right? And now the museum is saying, oh, the solution is we are going to return those remains, start returning more of the remains, and we're going to create a cast, and for display rather than of the remains, rather than having the actual remains. But that's something they could have done ever since. They shouldn't have to wait for investigators to come and tell them, expose them. This is something, if they can do this cast, no, they could have done that every since. But at least that's a movement in the right direction. Yes, Helen, your thoughts.
Oh, I got thoughts. So when we were reviewing this article, what really struck me is that, like, I'm glad, like, yes, it's a little bit too late. Of course it is. But at least the American Natural History Museum is at least trying to do something to release those remains to the people that should have them. And I don't have any skin in that game, but I understand having those ancestors and familial bonds that unite a culture. Like the person that's dead, whatever, but it has a symbolic meaning to these people. So I'm all in for that. And I think that's important to recognize. But what I'm more concerned about is the way that museums have just been holding on to Native Americans, people of color artifacts, whether they're, Black people or Latinas, whatever it is, that they're still holding on to these artifacts in their own museums. And the tribes and other people have to get special permission to go into the archives and look at the things that this is not only happening in the United States, it's happening in other like in England and other countries that have these sort of native populations a part of their culture, and they have to actually, they're not getting to experience their own history. They have to do it with gatekeepers, and they have to cut through red tape when really it's theirs. And people can quibble about that, but I'm just pointing it out. It's not our history; it's their history. And when I first heard about this on an episode of Last Week Tonight, and then when I read this article, like that's where my mind immediately went. It is the holding and gatekeeping of things that do not belong to us, and I know, and museums will cry, as you mentioned before. I think it was Kelley or John. I'm blanking right now because I'm having that brain tonight. But about how the museums are belly aching because they're going to lose money. I am so sorry. I feel so sorry for you. Cry, cry, cry. Or what you do is that you have conversations with people of that particular culture that you're using those artifacts to make your displays, and you talk to them about, like, hey, let's find a happy medium. And then the things that are just kind of sitting in storage should be returned to those people. I think everything is negotiable, and we can find an even balance. But because people are concerned about profits over people, we see that pattern over and over and over again. This is just another example of it. So that's where my kind of concern went, because learning for their younger generation to learn about their people that came before them and their own history is way more important than the white person's view of our history. I think that's a more important conversation, that we need to be having. So I'm going to pass it back to you, Kelley, because I know you have other thoughts because you have a big brain.
Hey, I don't know if I have a big brain. I do have a lot of thoughts, though, but they're not always good thoughts. One of the things that this conversation sparked in me was an old memory of when I was like in second grade, and when I went on a field trip to the Field Museum in Chicago, and I was so frightened by the Egyptian mummies I couldn't even look at them. They scared the shit out of me. So I don't even know how appropriate it is to have these things on public display where anyone can see them in the first place. They should at least have trigger warnings. I don't know if they do nowadays. I would hope that they do, but I don't know. I haven't been to a museum like that in quite some time. However, and I'm going to go back again with saying something that maybe people don't like. I do think we need these repositories to learn more about the human species, how we've changed through the millennia, and for medical purposes, for medical research. So as a scientist, I have no problem with keeping these ancient remains available to study. But I do think we need, as everybody has said, we need to be sensitive to the feelings of the ancestors of these people, even if I personally think those feelings are a bit silly. Again, so maybe one day, and this is what I was thinking, it's just totally silly, but if one day, if we can ever invent a time machine, we can go back and ask people if it's okay to have their remains in museums in the future, explain why we want to. And I just wonder how many people would actually agree to that. I don't think we'd have a whole lot of remains on display in museums if we did that. So, and another thing, like if I know we want to return these remains back to the ancestors of the people, but what do we do like with the ancient remains of a Scythian or an Akkadian? Who do we return those to? Do we just take them back to where they were found to begin with and chunk them back in the ground where some souvenir collector is going to go and get them for the black market? I don't know. I don't know. I'm going to send it back to John, though.
I think that just on keying off your last point, that, civilizations and peoples that no longer exist, of course, you're not going to be able to send them anywhere. However, it's sort of like Egypt wants they want their mummies back, and they want their relics back. and they have a vibrant ancient history museum in Cairo. And Hamas, I guess is his last name, the Ministry of Antiquities, and that they're starting to get a little jealous of, and cautious about where their artifacts are going. And they still are open to research and things like that. And scientists work with them all the time, but still, most of the people that they got from this were from donations, and they were still collecting remains up until 1996, 6 years after the repatriation can't talk bill was passed into law. And I just think that, if they knew already, which they had to, that they were, they have to pass these back, then why did they not just not accept it? It was from a journalist who came back with a shrunken head named Timmy from South America. Most of those shrunken heads generally aren't real. They're usually monkeys, not humans, but some of them are real. And so it was a booming business down there, just from my own personal experience. But I already told you the story of Kea, the 70-year-old who's waiting for his grandfather's remains. And so that's when, if you can trace those back to an exact thing that happened during a genocidal thing, yeah, you should. If it's like Scythian, what are you going to do? There's nothing you can do. Those people aren't even a people anymore. So there's no place to put those. So you keep them in the museum and study them. But there's that. But the African American.
I'm gonna pause you right there because we don't have much more time in the segment, and I want to hear Phil's final opinions, give my final word, and we're going to close out.
Okay. Phil?
The thing is that Kelley made a good point about the remains of those groups that doesn't exist now in present day. What are they going to do with them? And I think, I agree with him. I will say that those remains, maybe yes, the museum can keep, but they need to treat those remains with respect, get as much background information as possible, and display the information together with the remains. They can display the all of that information, because it's about educating younger students, educating the masses, educating people, and giving, if they have archaeological evidence in terms of stories, finding stories around these groups, right? That can also be posted along with the information. Make it interesting, uh, and give some historical background to make people aware. Okay, this is where these people are from. This is what they used to do, and these are some interesting facts about them, and to help persons realize they were humans just like we are, right? And they were struggling with the same things that or similar things we struggled with, even sometimes on a bigger scale, because they didn't have medical science or certain technologies to help make life a lot easier. Yeah. So, yeah, I think that's the way to go dealing with those types of remains. And Helen, you want to close us out? Thank you.
Yeah, and I didn't get to mention this before, but there's also a lot of fraud within these artifacts. There were people that were hired to go into these museums, and they were experts on the certain culture and what their artifacts were, and they found that there's frauds and copycats even within museums, and they say that they are authentic. So also keep that in mind, when we're talking about these things. Because there's a little part of my brain that's going, are the remains of the people that they say they're the remains of? I mean, if there's records back it up, I'm fine. But it's just a little little thing that's floating around in my brain, because I'm a skeptic, and you should be skeptical. And on that note of being skeptical, if you want to learn to be more skeptical, check out more from the nonprofits. Just click over here.